In this presentation, we're going to be talking about Eduardo Bonilla Silva's article, Rethinking Racism. In this article, what he is trying to do is he's trying to push us to think more structurally about racism and race in general. And what he does is he sets out 7 different ways in which he argues we're taught to think about racism, what he calls the idealist conception of racism. I would consider this sort of the components of the dominant ideology. And then he challenges each one of these aspects of the idealist conception of racism and really pushes us to think about how racism is a structural phenomenon. Now, this article also goes very well with the article we're going to talk about after this, and that's Barbara Rissman's article about gender as structure. So in both cases, they're pushing us to think about concepts that we typically think of as in an individualistic way, or individual concepts, such as racism being held within the mind of an individual, or gender being an individual characteristic, and they're pushing us to think more structurally, more sociologically about these concepts, thinking about them in broader terms. Okay, so like I said, the purpose of Bonilla Silva's article is to develop a structural theory of racism and not just think of racism as a set of beliefs held in an individual's mind. Now, this is different than even orthodox or neo-Marxists, orthodox Marxists or neo-Marxists, in a sense that they would consider racism simply a symptom of a class-driven type of inequality in our society, and they would see racism simply as an ideology. But Bonilla Silva argues that we need to think about race more than just as a ideological characteristic, but rather a structural characteristic as well. Okay, so we shouldn't think of it as just a all-powerful ideology, right? Racism is part of a broader racialized social system, is essentially what Bonilla Silva is arguing. Okay, so like I said, he lays out 7 different components of the idealist conception of racism. Let's be really clear here, he is not advocating these idealist conceptions of racism. This is what he's being critical of. So the way he organizes his article is he lays out 7 different ways in which we're taught to think about racism, which essentially reinforces the status quo. It keeps people being less critical of racism and racial inequality in our society. So the first aspect of the idealist conception of racism is that the social system itself is not racist, right? That racism is an individualistic characteristic. So a business, a firm, a society as a whole cannot be racist according to the idealist conception of racism. Now, Henry Louis Gates has an interesting quote on this topic. He says, "In America, there's institutional racism that we all inherit and participate in, like breathing the air in this room, and we have to become sensitive to it." So basically, racism is essentially normal. Institutional racism is normal, and we tend to not even see it. It's like the water that a fish swims and they don't really notice it. And so what both Henry Louis Gates and Bonilla Silva are pushing us to do is to consider those things that we take for granted when it comes to racism. A second aspect of the idealist conception of racism is the idea that racism is a psychological phenomenon and should be studied at the individual level, right? This reinforces what we've been talking about, that the idea that institutions can't be racist. And if this was correct, then we could learn everything we need to learn about racism simply by surveying people. If we could understand how many people are racist, then we could understand the totality of racism. Bonilla Silva is critical of this, basically says it's more than just a psychological phenomenon, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, a third aspect of the idealist conception of racism is that we're taught to believe that racism is a static phenomenon. That is, the racism of the past is the same as the racism today, it doesn't change over time. Now I'm going to put up a couple of different pictures to demonstrate how Bonilla Silva is critical of this. And the first picture here is a famous picture of the integration of Little Rock, Arkansas High School, not Little Rock High School in Arkansas. And this is in the late 1950s, and you can see there are two people that I want to highlight in this picture. One is the black student walking into a school, and then behind her you see a white student yelling at her, and I can guarantee you she's not yelling, "Welcome to Little Rock High," right? She's very demonstrative and seems to be almost vicious in her attack to her new classmate. Now, this is an example of very overt racism. It's in your face. There's nothing subtle about it, and that is, Bonilla Silva argues, what is more common in the past. Now, there's another couple things that are interesting about this picture. Is you can see in the background that there are federal troops enforcing the integration of Little Rock High School because local law enforcement was unwilling to support the integration of schools in Arkansas at the time. So the federal troops were actually brought in. And what's another thing that's interesting about this is these two women, decades later, actually reconciled, and the white woman in the background apologized for her behavior that day. But what's really interesting about that is that while the black student in this picture remembers that day, it's seared into her memory, she'll never forget that day, the white woman yelling behind her actually has no active memory of that day. And what that suggests to me is that this was a normal day for her. This is not something really unusual, that the level of overt racism was so commonplace back in the late 1950s in the southern states and in other states as well. But it was so normal that this is something that a person could be acting this way and not actually remember that they had. Now, this is an example of overt racism. I want to take a look at a more contemporary picture. And this picture here is an example of a more contemporary type of racism. It's more subtle, it's more covert, more symbolic, less in-your-face type of racism. Now, this is a picture of LeBron James on the cover of Vogue magazine with a fashion model. And I've asked other classes about this, and they have routinely suggested that for some of them, they see King Kong imagery here, the idea that the black male is made out to be overly aggressive, potentially sexually aggressive, and the white woman here is sort of the damsel in distress type of thing. Now, what's curious about this is what was the process through which this particular picture was placed on the cover of the magazine. It was tremendously controversial, and that's why we're talking about it. And what I would suggest is that they probably took hundreds of pictures of these two individuals for this photo shoot, and this is the one they picked because because it reinforces the negative stereotypes we have of black males in our society as being more aggressive. I really doubt that LeBron James got this expression without being told to act this way. I'm sure he didn't have this expression on his face through the whole photo shoot, but this is the one not only that got selected to be in the magazine, but got selected to be on the cover. It reinforces negative stereotypes, but it does so in a way that it can be argued that this is not really racist, and people who are claiming it's racist are playing the race card. They're not. It's not really legitimately racist, and so subtle symbolic racism allows for this fine line to be in which the person making a racist choice of putting this on the cover can argue that they're actually not being racist. So I think these two pictures demonstrate the way in which racism has changed from a very overt racism of the past to a more subtle form in present-day America. Now, we are also taught that the idealist conception of racism teaches us that racism is incorrect thinking, it's irrational, that people who are racist are simply bigoted, and the question here is, can a person act in a racist way in a rational way? That is, can they essentially get some benefit from acting in a racist way? Now, I would argue that a society as a whole loses out when there's widespread racism or racism at all, but that doesn't mean that individual people aren't benefiting from racist action of their own racist action or racist action of other people, often in the same racial group that the person is. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva throws out a potential example of this. He argues that when a white family who's living in an urban area has a child who's about to enter kindergarten, and they look at the neighborhood schools and come to the conclusion that the school has a racial composition that they're not comfortable with, and so they decide to move to a predominantly white or exclusively white neighborhood in the suburbs, which is not an uncommon pattern, and sociologists have a name for this. This is white flight. Then Bonilla Silva argues that this is an example of rational racism. Now, by saying it's rational racism, he's not trying to legitimate it, he's not trying to justify it, but he's trying to explain it and saying that some people win and some people lose when racism takes place. And so I would push you to think about this question. Is it, do you agree or disagree that a white family moving to a more predominantly white neighborhood in order to avoid sending their children to a school with a racial composition that they're not comfortable with, is that racist? Bonilla Silva says it is, and in fact it reproduces inequality because it reproduces racial segregations in neighborhoods and in schools. Something to think about. Okay, we're also Bonilla Silva also argues that we're taught to think of racism as overt behavior. We sort of talked about this before, that it's not seen really as subtle or indirect or symbolic racism. We're also taught to believe that contemporary racism really doesn't exist, that any racial inequality that exists today is simply a remnant of past discrimination that's taken place. And this is what's really going on here, is the promotion of a colorblind ideology or racelessness ideology, that we're in a post-racial society in which there is no racism taking place. Now, like I said, any racial inequality would be explained as this historical effect that would dissipate over generations. But as we will see later in the semester, unfortunately, racism, in at least my opinion, is alive and well in the United States, and something we should take seriously and not dismiss with this colorblind ideology. Lastly, racism is analyzed typically in a circular manner. That is, racism is established by racist behavior, and that is proof that there is racism. Is sort of a circular tautological argument or logic here, and Bonilla Silva's theory really avoids this kind of tautological circular logic by explaining why racism exists, which we'll get to now. Okay, so what he's proposing in this article is that our society and all societies are made up of a racialized social system, that it places different racial groups into a hierarchy, of the most advantaged being on the top and the least advantaged being on the bottom. Now, if you think about this, well, if you believe in the colorblind ideology, this would not make sense, that people would argue that there is no racial hierarchy. So, well, think to yourself, if you, I'm going to list off 5 racial groups, and of course, race is a social construction, so I'm just making up these 5, but it's not uncommon to have these 5 groups listed on surveys, for example. But I want you to think about which of these 5 groups is the most advantaged and which is the least advantaged. Okay, the 5 groups are whites, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. which of these groups is the most advantaged, which is the least advantaged. Now, what I would argue is that there is wide consensus about the most advantaged groups. Most people in the society, well, even those who claim to be colorblind, would recognize that whites are typically the most advantaged racial group, followed by Asians, and then you have maybe Latinos being a middle group, and either Native Americans or African Americans on the bottom of the hierarchy. Now, I can't have a show of hands in an online class, but ask other people to see whether that is the general consensus among people you know. And I think you'll find that people will acknowledge that that's generally the racial hierarchy. Few people are going to argue that, for example, Native Americans are at the top, or that whites are at the bottom. But that's the colorblind ideology. People that believe in the colorblind ideology would downplay the idea that there was any racial hierarchy at all. Now, Bonilla Silva says that this racial hierarchy manifests itself in many ways, that we're stratified along a lot of different dimensions, including what he called greater economic remuneration. Here is that sort of the pay that people get for their work is racialized, and you can see that. We're also have a stratified social system in terms of access to good jobs, that certain racial groups, the more advantaged racial groups, are more likely to have better occupations or access to better occupations. Also, they have access to more political power. As you can see, this picture on the right here, picture of the U.S. Senate, it is essentially a lily white institution. That the vast majority of U.S. senators throughout history have been white, and they continue to be. This is not by accident, but according to Bonilla Silva, reflects the racialized social structure playing out in terms of political power. Interestingly, Bonilla Silva also argues that we assign higher social estimation to people who are higher, or members of groups that are higher on this racial hierarchy. So there's a white beauty standard, for example, that, well, he argues overtly that whites are viewed as smarter and better looking. So if we have a white beauty standard, then whites are more likely to adhere to that beauty standard. And people who are not white often try to approximate this white beauty standard. You see this in terms of hair straightening, or dyeing a person's skin to be lighter skin and whatnot. These kinds of efforts are a reflection of a white beauty standard, Bonilla Silva would argue. When it comes to being seen as smarter, it's very interesting that essentially white folks are given the assumption that they're smart. Right? Asians are also probably assumed to be good students. So I'm a white male. I can tell you this, that I've went from kindergarten all the way up to a PhD level as a student, and I never once had to walk into a classroom and overcome negative racial or, frankly, gender stereotypes. That there was an assumption, and this is essentially what Bonilla Silva is arguing, there was an assumption that whites were smart, and that was the baseline assumption until that was proven not to be the case, and they would continue to be seen as smart. And racial minorities are not granted that same baseline assumption about their level of intelligence. Now, I put this picture in to talk about a story from my own past, and this is almost 25 years now, at a time when I wanted to be a high school teacher, and so I was doing student teaching. I student taught seniors for a semester, and then I was teaching 7th graders in an inner city school in San Diego. And what's interesting about this school is San Diego Junior High School. It was made up, really is tremendously diverse. Literally, this school had about 25% white, 25% African American, 25% Hispanic, and 25% Asian. So it was quite diverse. And I remember the first day of school, I walked into this classroom and I saw one kid in particular who made me think that I would be comfortable teaching this. And there was this, essentially, is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who was dressed very nicely. And I remember exactly where he was sitting. He was sitting in the middle of the classroom. And I looked at him and thought, okay, well, I can see him in me. And I made an assumption that he was going to be a good student, and reflected upon this. It turns out that I was wrong about him. He was one of the one of the worst troublemakers, worst students in the class. But what was striking to me is that I made this assumption that he would be a good student. Now, the best student in the class turned out to be a kid which was on my left, sort of in the back of the room, who was a Mexican-American student, quiet. I didn't even notice him the first day. He was largely ignored by me, and frankly probably by other students, until he proved to be among the smarter students in the class. But my point here is that we as a society look at people and place them into boxes based on our preconceptions or our stereotypes, and we need to be more reflective about that. Now, I've been teaching for almost 25 years since this, and I can tell you now that when I walk into a classroom, I can, with no certainty, make any predictions about who's going to be the better students or worse students in my class. And what's frankly interesting about being a professor is I get to see the performance of students that often is ignored or invisible to fellow students. And it's not always the students that you think are the best students who actually end up setting the curve or doing the best in the class. Often it's students who you might not think are going to do well, students who don't fit the stereotypical definition of being a good student or being a smart person. And so, long story short, I think it's valuable for us to step back and consistently be reflective about to what degree are we assigning these stereotypes, either positively to advantaged groups or members of advantaged groups, or negatively towards members of disadvantaged groups. Okay, there's also an interesting concept that Bonilla Silva throws out there, and he says that members of privileged racial groups also receive a psychological wage. Essentially, this is the wage of whiteness that's been referred to. The idea here is that people feel good about themselves because they're white, right? So they look at themselves and they think, well, I feel good simply because I'm a white person. I'm in a privileged position in this society. And here's an example of this. Say you have a poor white male, right, who is unemployed, poorly educated. By all measures of society, he would be seen as really a failure. He can still grasp onto a sense that there's something positive about him. He can say, well, I may be poor and I may not be well educated, but at least I'm not black, or at least I'm not Hispanic. I mean, this psychological wage of whiteness, feeling good about oneself because of their racial position. I would argue, and we get into this if it was a race and ethnic relations class, but I would argue that psychological wage is in many ways the way the agrarian elite in the southern states bought the loyalty of the non-slave owning whites back a few hundred years ago. It was essentially that race was created and whites were given this psychological wage. Even if they weren't materially advantaged by being white, they were given a psychological benefit, and that led them to provide a buffer between the agrarian elite and the slaves, who vastly outnumbered the agrarian elite in this region at the time. Okay, Bonilla Silva also argues that members of the privileged racial groups are able to draw physical and social boundaries between themselves and other races. When he's talking about physical boundaries, he's talking about segregation, and there's unfortunately a long and ugly history of racial segregation in our society that is persistent, especially for African Americans in our society, that it continues to persist. And I take a couple of pictures here from the past about overt racism and ways people would picket and intimidate members of minority groups as a way to enforce and reinforce racial segregation. Now, I put a picture of a school bus up here because one of the social policies that directly attempted to alleviate the problem of segregation in education was school busing. Now, I was born in 1960s and went to school in the 1970s and 1980s. And in the 1970s, school busing was a social issue of as great a prominence as any socialist issue of today. That is, right today, I would say that it was. You asked me what are the major social issues or political issues of the day, and I would say maybe abortion or same-sex rights for same-sex couples, that type of thing. Well, in the 1970s, school busing was front and center, and what's fascinating is that schools in this country were less segregated in the 1970s than they are today. I know that I went to a school where about 20 to 25% of my classmates were black students who were bused in from southeast San Diego, which and that happened across all major cities across this country, and went a long way to providing better education and frankly for racial minority students, but also in some ways a better education for the white students who weren't just being educated with other white students. But opponents of racial integration fought school busing tooth and nail and eventually won. And it has essentially been dismantled. We don't really bus for racial integration purposes to this day. And we can get into a lot of details. But really, it's been fought just as affirmative action policies have been fought and whatnot. So, long story short, people have opposed school busing. Bonilla Silva would argue because they were protecting their privileged racial position, right? Whites would act in racist ways to maintain their privileged position in the racialized social structure. Now, you also argue that we have social boundaries. Related to this is the concept of cultural capital here, that there's different cultural habits and styles that are associated with different racial groups, and those habits and styles that are associated with whiteness typically are given greater prestige or status in society, right? So I put a picture here of a place setting for a very fancy meal, and well, this is what is considered to be the highbrow, more privileged, more high status type of culture, right? And so people who adhere to this type of culture or have cultural capital as valued this way, often adhering to such a culture is used as a marker, an indicator of whether someone is worthy of being held in high regard. Now, in the world of music, there's also a comparison. Now, typically, the highest, most prestigious form of music would be classical music, right? So, if someone was going to the symphony, that would be seen as very high status. And Bonilla Silva would argue, and I would agree with him, and say, well, this is just a arbitrary, subjective choice that classical music is the best type of music, or deserves to have the most prestige. Why classical music and not jazz, for example? It has a different style. It's a different type of music, but it is racialized in the sense that typically classical music is associated with privileged racial groups, and jazz is often associated with blacks, for example. But is that is this greater prestige that we give to classical music relative to jazz legitimate, right? It would essentially, what is being argued by Bonilla, Silva, and others who focus on cultural capital across racial groups, is that this is an arbitrary choice. So why classical music? Why jazz? Frankly, you could throw rap music in there as well. Which music is better or worthy of more esteem is a totally subjective choice, and is not. But really, those people in positions of power get to determine what is considered better or more valuable, and what should be studied and what should be looked down upon. This is one example of how the racialized social structure is reflected in music, but it's reflected in just about every other aspect of our culture. Okay, so if you take all of these factors, you'll have a sense of the racialized social structure, and the few things I've mentioned don't make up the totality of this, but just think about the different ways in which our society is racialized, organized in a way that advantages certain racial groups and disadvantages others. Taken all together, that's how we have a racial social structure. Okay, so the more dissimilar the life chances of people in a given society based on race, the more racialized our social system is, right? So essentially, people in different racial groups act in ways that reinforce their racial advantage. This is what Bonilla Silva calls a racial contest or racial contestation, and it manifests itself in racism, right? So he also argues that not only are societies stratified in terms of race, they can also be stratified in terms of class and gender and other axes of stratification. Sexual orientation, for example, will be another axis of stratification that organizes the social structure all at the same time. All right. So what he's essentially saying is that race will continue to exist in a society as long as the life chances of members of different racial groups are different. But if those life chances become indistinguishable, then the racial distinctions between different groups will disappear. They will become meaningless and disappear. So essentially, race is a social construct that exists to stratify society, and people act on that racialized social structure and act in ways that try to benefit their own racial group. Okay, so this conception of racism is not consistent with the idealist conception of racism, which argues that we can essentially educate our way out of racism. That if you think of racism from idealist conception of racism, then you assume that racism is simply held in the minds of individuals, and if we just teach everyone not to be racist, then racism will go away and we'll all be considered the same race. Well, it is not that simple. It's not just held in the minds of individuals, but rather it structures society, and people act upon that as well. Okay, again, this is not a race and ethnic relations class. If you took a race and ethnic relations class with me or another professor, you would definitely hear this concept of races being social constructions. They are made up. They don't have biological meaning, but they have tremendous social consequence. And so this racism we talk about, again, is the result of racial contestation that exists in the racialized social structure, and the purpose of racism is to further the interests of one's racial group and to either maintain their privileged position or to challenge the inequities that exist in the system. Now here's a picture of one of my first mentors, Ruben Roombout, and one thing he said to me and to in a presentation that always stuck with me. He says, "Race is a pigment of the imagination." Essentially, it's a pun. It's a play on words. He was basically pointing out that race is by being a figment of the imagination, is a social construction. It's not real, but it is, as sociologists know, has tremendous social consequence, and that's what this article is about. Now, the racial contestation, or the struggle between groups, doesn't just exist between those on the top and those on the bottom. It can happen within the same racial group or very similarly positioned racial groups. For example, Bonilla Silva argues that there's a struggle between blacks who were born here in the United States and black immigrants. Now, according to Bonilla Silva, black immigrants would occupy a more privileged position in the racial hierarchy, that they would not have as many negative racial stereotypes placed upon them. But the children of black immigrants face an unusual circumstance in the sense that they are pressured to downwardly assimilate, that is, to as they lose the protective elements of being a black immigrant that their parents may have. Say, their parents may speak with an accent or dress in a way that marks them as an immigrant. Their children may not. The children of black immigrants may not possess these markers of them being an immigrant. So they may have the ethnicity of just being black or being African American placed upon them externally from other people. And so there's some resistance to this and trying to maintain a identity as a black immigrant rather than just being black in the United States. So this manifests itself in terms of a struggle between U.S.-born blacks and black immigrants, and this tension between these groups demonstrates, according to Bonilla Silva, a degree of racial contestation that takes place along the whole spectrum of the racialized social system. All right, so the advantages that Bonilla Silva's ideas have over the traditional views or the idealist conception of racism are the following. That racial phenomenon, racism, is seen as normal. It's not something unusual. It's part of normal operations that take place in a racially stratified society. The changing nature of racism is explained through this idea of racial contestation. You have a racialized social system that is hierarchical and with some groups that are advantaged and some groups that are disadvantaged. The racial contestation exists when some groups attempt to maintain their privileged positions and others attempt to improve their racial standing. And so this is the cause of racism that exists in our society. His ideas also explain both overt and covert racism, rather than arguing that racism is unchanging and static and has always been overt. He argues that there could be covert racism that has tremendous consequence in our society. Someone coming from a colorblind ideology would assert that racism only manifests itself in overt ways, and therefore, if you don't see racism overtly, then it must not exist in the same way, or with as much consequence as it did in the past. Also, interestingly, as I said before, racism is seen as rational. Now, once again, Bonilla Silva is not trying to legitimate or justify racism. He would argue, I'm sure, that racism as a whole has a negative consequence for all of society, but individuals can benefit by acting in racist ways or benefit by the racism of others simply because it reinforces a privileged position in the racial hierarchy. So it's not as if, what he's basically saying is people act in a racist way, not just out of hatred or bigotry, but rather there's some material reward that results from this type of behavior. And lastly, his theory, Bonilla Silva's ideas on racism, suggests that contemporary racism exists, and in racism or racial inequality exists today is not just simply the remnants of a distant past, the results of historic discrimination, but rather argues that contemporary racism still exists today. Okay, so there's some interesting examples about how the racialized social system has changed over time, and one way is that some racial distinctions that exist in the past now really have dissipated, and some racial groups or racial boundaries between racial groups no longer have significance. For example, there are stereotypes of Irish. Well, I happen to be mostly Irish, and my grandfather was an immigrant to this country in 1924. And when he came to this country, the Irish were not considered fully white, and were subject to a level of discrimination that simply doesn't exist anymore. There's some negative stereotypes that exist of the Irish at the time. Those negative stereotypes don't really exist anymore. For example, one stereotype of the Irish is that they're drunks, or they're likely to be alcoholics. And one example of this is if the vehicle that policemen will often round up people if there's violence is referred to as a paddy wagon. Well, paddy wagon is a reference to paddy, which is a nickname for being Irish. So there's this idea that Irish folks are drunk and angry, and those negative stereotypes of Irish really aren't present as much as they were in the past. Another example of this are stereotypes of Jews. In the 1940s, there was a stereotype that Jews were very athletic. Now, in contemporary America, there's not this wide-ranging stereotype of Jews being overly athletic, but it's a reflection of the opportunities available to Jews in the 1940s, that they may not have had as a level playing field or open opportunities in some areas of life, but on the athletic field they were given free rein to rise to as high a heights as their athletic ability would allow them. So the folk theories of success that Jews employed back in the 1940s emphasized athletics to a degree much more than it does today. So as a result, they flourished more in athletics back then than they do now. And so back then, when it was a folk theory of success emphasis for Jews, they were stereotyped as being overly athletic, and now those stereotypes really don't exist anymore. Now we probably would argue that there's this widely held stereotype that African Americans are more athletically gifted than other racial groups, and I would argue that it is just as racist to argue that blacks are more athletic than other racial groups as it is to argue that whites are more intelligent. I would argue that there are sociological reasons that push blacks into athletic endeavors that are linked to their folk theories of success and what opportunities are available to them, and other equally athletic members of other racial groups may not emphasize athletics as much as they would if other ways of being successful weren't open to them. One other example along this lines I want to talk about is got to do with Asian Americans. There's an interesting example. Up until 1924, there were a fairly significant number of Asian immigrants out on the West Coast. Most of the immigrants on the West Coast were migrant immigrants, and they tended to be negatively selected in terms of education. And then in 1924, essentially all immigration from Asia was cut off to this country up until 1965. And then after 1965, the route to immigration to this country, legal immigration to this country from Asia, was linked to family reunification and occupational related immigrants. So, long story short, what happened was post 1965 there was a brain drain, so-called brain drain immigrant flows from Asia. So the so there were more positively selected, more highly educated immigrants from Asia coming to this country, and the negative stereotypes that existed of Asians back in the 1920s really didn't apply to the new brain drain immigrants from Asia coming after 1965. And so the point here is that the stereotypes don't no longer fit, the life chances becoming increasingly similar. Some race theorists interestingly argue that Asians are the next in line to be considered white in our society. It's a very interesting concept, something you would get into more in the race and ethnic relations class, but it's thought-provoking. What Bonilla Silva is basically saying is that if the life chances of two racial groups become indistinguishable, then the racial distinctions that we make up will no longer apply, and those races will be considered the same. The point of this whole conversation is there are many examples of how this has happened already for white ethnics. You could say the Irish, Italians, Eastern Europeans often are now just considered white, whereas those distinctions between of ethnicities had real significance, 80 or 100 years ago, and increasingly race theorists, racial researchers are arguing that the same process is now taking place for Asians. Okay. So there's 4 major takeaway messages of Bonilla Silva's article here, and that is that the racial practices that reproduce inequality in contemporary America are increasingly covert. That is, people are, when they express their racism, they tend to do so in either same race environments. As a white person, I have access to all white conversations, and what I have found, while it's not happening all the time, I do sometimes run into situations where white people are talking with only white people, and they are more willing to say things that I don't think they would say if there was a racial minority present in the conversation. So this indicates to me that people are somewhat conscious of not saying things that are racist when there's a racial minority present, but also I think people are increasingly hesitant to talk about race in an overt way for fear of being seen as racist and wanting to put forward a politically correct presentation of self. Okay. Another argument Bonilla Silva makes is that these practices are embedded in the normal operations of institutions in our society, that the structure itself has a racialized component, and it's unlike the idealist version of racism that Bonilla Silva is being critical of, which would argue that institutions cannot be racist. Bonilla Silva is actually arguing that institutions are racist in their normal operation, so it's not something that's unusual. Racism is, like we talked about before, sort of the air that we breathe or the water we swim in has racialized components to it, and we need to think very overtly and critically about how racism is playing out in ways that we may not even realize. Third, people avoid direct racial terminology. This is an example of this is the colorblind ideology. And essentially, people, especially white people, don't want to talk about race. They won't touch it with a 10-foot pole because it's too sensitive. It's almost become a taboo subject to talk about racial inequality. And so that silence helps to reinforce racial inequality. So people avoid racial terminology because they don't want to be seen as as racist. Like I said, that just reinforces racism. And lastly, that racism is invisible to most whites. The fact is that most whites don't experience racial discrimination not nearly as in the way that racial minorities do, and in their day-to-day lives they live in a world where they're not impacted by their race. Myself, as a white person, I can say that I never wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror and think, Jim, you're a white person. How is that going to affect your day? How is it going to affect your life? It doesn't really affect my life, and that's an aspect of white privilege that all whites benefit from. But what comes along with this is increased likelihood of accepting the colorblind ideology, because if racism doesn't affect me, then it's not hard to believe that it doesn't affect anyone, right? So the idea here is that just because whites don't see racism doesn't mean that racism isn't taking place in the day-to-day lives of racial minorities in our society. Okay, so that is our presentation on Bonilla Silva's article, Rethinking Racism. I hope you found the ideas interesting and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them in our discussion boards on our course website, and thank you very much for listening.